This will be the final lesson in our series on Genesis, and we're going to pick up here with where Joseph is giving a final test to his brother's sincerity of repentance for what they did to him, and it will center on Benjamin, who was just greatly honored in front of them all by being given 5 times as much food as his brothers at the luncheon that Joseph had invited them to. So he tells his steward to load up the brothers with food and provisions, and then also to add the silver to the sacks as before. But this time he also has his own special silver cup put into Benjamin's sack of food, then sends the brothers on their way home. So he's adding a little twist to it. It's the same as before with a little extra for a final test. But shortly after he sends them off, he tells his steward to run after them and accuse Benjamin of stealing the silver cup. And the steward is supposed to say that the cup was used for divination, but that doesn't mean that Joseph actually did use it for that. That's just what that kind of cup was used for typically in Egypt. And if he had such a cup and they didn't know who he really was, why would Joseph need such a thing anyway, since he had demonstrated his ability to interpret dreams and so forth? So there's no reason that he would need a divination cup, is the point. So what it really means is that Joseph is still playing his role as a worshiper of heathen gods who could find out their plot by divination, but he's framing it to look like they stole the divination cup so he couldn't do that. So now let's look down here in verse 6, and it says the steward catches up to them and does what he was ordered, and while he searches their food sacks, the brothers offer themselves as slaves and the one found with the silver cup to be executed. But the steward says he will only take the thief as a slave and let the rest go. Now when the thief, quote unquote, turns out to be Benjamin, the brothers tear their clothes in despair and return to the city. Unbeknownst to them, Joseph has set up a test to see if they'd still abandon their little brother to save their own skin, but they have passed this test. Even so, they're now experiencing the depth of grief they had caused their father so long ago, and in both cases, it has come through false pretenses. They lied to their father about what happened to their brother, and now their brother is lying to them and making them have the same kind of degree of grief that they had caused their father. But the lie has a purpose. It's to set them up to test them and see whether they would still be the kind of people who would abandon their own little brother to save themselves. So now down in verse 14, it says that they all arrive at Joseph's house, and once again they bow to the ground before him. They don't even try this time to plead their case anymore, but they have resigned themselves to what they expect will be their fate, which wasn't deserved from the current false accusations. They knew they were innocent of theft, but from their own past sins. So they're just deciding that this is all happening because of what they did long ago, and that they were being falsely accused because of their past actions. So Joseph repeats what the steward had said about letting them go, but keeping Benjamin as a slave. But as we'll see here in verse 18, Judah pleads with him to listen to their whole story. Now keep in mind that Joseph never knew what they had said to Jacob until the famine. And as we can see down here, let's skip down to verse 28. Let me get there eventually. Only now does he learn that they had told him Joseph had been killed by wild animals. There's no way that Joseph would have had to know this unless they had told him in an earlier meeting, and the text didn't report that. At any rate, Judah adds that his father will literally die of grief if they return without Benjamin. Notice also that in contrast to his having left his brother Joseph to die, Judah offers to die for his brother Benjamin. It's this this willingness to sacrifice himself for his brother that would be ultimately fulfilled in the Messiah. All the trials and strife have refined the entire clan into a people who, at least for the time being, exemplify the kingdom of God. If only modern Christian leaders would also choose to be brought to the point of refinement so they too could model the king whose name they bear. But we'll go down to verse 45 here, or chapter 45, sorry. And at this point, Joseph can't stand it anymore, so he orders his staff to leave him alone with his brothers. But he breaks down and begins to sob so loud that all of Pharaoh's household can hear him anyway. And finally, he tells them who he is and asks if his father's still alive. But of course, the brothers are too dumbfounded to speak, probably also because he's suddenly speaking their language. So it's undoubtedly occurring to them that he has overheard all their conversations and knew exactly what they were saying all this time. So now, here in verse 4, it says that Joseph displays his exemplary character again by showing this great forgiveness, since it was all about God's plan to save his people from the famine, which would at that point last another 5 years. It's only 2 years into the famine by now. And the lesson we should learn from this is that God often allows great hardship and tragedy not to break us, but to discipline us. As the Apostle Paul will put it much later, the sufferings of this life are not worthy to be compared with the honor to be revealed in us in eternity. And we should strive to be like Joseph here in this story, because it's the way he recognizes God's hand in the events of his life, even if our own lives seem rather ordinary in comparison. The point is to keep an eye out for that. So at this point, we might wonder why God would have had to take all these measures at all, going through all these steps. But we could have asked that question back in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve first sinned, because God could have snapped his fingers and simply created us all in our eternal state and not bothered with any of that at all. But, of course, on the other hand, such a thing would be unworthy of the God who created us in his image. Only a love freely given from a life genuinely lived would be worthy of God. In other words, it would be a sham, and it would not be something that the one true God would perpetrate, even if it means all these thousands of years of human history. Now, if we look at Constable's notes, again referenced in the description, there's a short list of the many parallels between this life of Joseph and that of the Messiah, and I will also add some more points to the list there. It's pretty short, and there's other things we could say, such as that both Joseph and Jesus are the favorite son. Both made claims to a special position. Both were hated by their brothers. Both were betrayed and deemed worthy of death. And while they were away from their brothers, both secured the means by which they would be saved, and both received a bride during that time. Both returned from the dead, and one figuratively and one literally, and both became a blessing to Jews and Gentiles alike. There's a lot more than that, but that gives you the idea, at least from what we've read here in Genesis, that such things are things we should always keep an eye out for, because this one is so obvious. It's not always going to be this obvious, but the point is that we need to keep our eyes peeled when we're studying the Bible about these things. And once again, we're reminded that God can be trusted to have good reasons for whatever pain, tragedy, grief, hardship, and bewilderment that we might experience in life. If we belong to him, we need to trust him. So now let's go down to verse 15. And there we see that finally Joseph's brothers, who couldn't say a kind word to him before, are able to talk finally. And of course, we can only imagine what they said because it isn't written for us. But meanwhile, the word spread throughout Pharaoh's household that Joseph's brothers had come. So Pharaoh tells Joseph to spare no expense in seeing to it that all of his brothers, their families, possessions, everything, and their father, of course, will all be moved down to Egypt and settle in the best land, because, as noted earlier, there would be 5 more years of famine in that area of the world, including Canaan, where Jacob and the brothers had been living. So now down to verse 21. And Joseph sends them off with a gentle warning not to fight amongst themselves along the way. There's some discussion about what that really means, what he was talking about, but the point mostly is just kind of a side comment, and maybe just kind of a wink when he said that, who knows. But the main point is that it took a bit of convincing for Jacob to believe that Joseph was alive at all, let alone prospering. But finally they convince him, and he agrees to move down to Egypt. So that brings us to chapter 46. And it says that along the way, Jacob gets a visit from God at the place where he had that vision of stairs to the sky, or to the heavens, so many years before. And God tells him that this move to Egypt is his doing, and that his people will become a great nation as promised. But though he himself will die there, his descendants will eventually return to Canaan. Constable points out in the notes that the text calls him Israel again here, after he finally believes his son is alive and and well after all. And to that we could add that his joy at the realization could be compared to the future joy of the women when they realized that Jesus had risen from the dead. There's a lot of parallels there as well. Now to verse 27. And most of the rest of this chapter is a list of all the families, which the Greek text, the Septuagint on the left, totals as 75 rather than the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text on the right, which has 70. The difference is possibly due to the Greek text including Joseph's family, and this is the number also given by the first Christian martyr Stephen in Acts 7:14. He also says 75. So then, regardless of that, Joseph meets them in Goshen, and they all have a good cry, and then he tells them that the Egyptians find shepherds repulsive, which is what all of Jacob's family were, which turned out to aid the people of Israel remaining separate from the surrounding culture of the Egyptians, as opposed to their mingling with other people in Canaan. So the revulsion of the Egyptians to shepherds would actually serve the purpose of God in keeping them separate. We'll also find out later that, especially I think in Constable's notes, that the Egyptians also had a special loathing of body hair for some reason, and that would be another way to keep the people separate, because the people of Israel, of course, didn't shave their beards or anything, so that too made them repulsive to the Egyptians, not in the way of hating them as people, but they just didn't have things in common, didn't tolerate some of the the work they did and their appearance. So that's what that's about. So now we come to chapter 47, where it says Joseph takes 5 of his brothers to see Pharaoh, where they repeat what Joseph advised them to repeat about their being shepherds and being totally honest and not being afraid of the revulsion of the Egyptians. So not only does Pharaoh grant the best land to them, he also puts them in charge of his own flocks and herds, especially since his own people consider that kind of work beneath them. So this was a win-win. And then down in verse 7, we'll see that Joseph presents his father to Pharaoh, and Jacob gives him a blessing. So the lowly older man is giving a blessing to the powerful empire official, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And then Pharaoh in return sees to it that Jacob and all his family, all his people would have whatever they needed. So things are going pretty well at the moment. And then down in verse 13, it says that the famine is reaching the point where Egypt and Canaan have run out of money to buy food anymore. So Joseph tells them to start selling their animals, and when the famine still continues, they have nothing left to offer but themselves and their land. So they willingly sell themselves to Pharaoh, and they are moved into the cities, as it shows. Let me go down to verse 20. Because that's where the food was stored, and there was no way to plow the land anyway. There had been no rain, and so he had them all moved to the cities. And in this way, Pharaoh came to own everything and everyone, at least in Egypt. And the only people exempted were the priests of Egypt, who didn't have any land in the first place and depended on Pharaoh for their support anyway. And then the Israelites. Those were the only 2 groups of people who were not sold into slavery. So clearly God's promise to Abraham that he would father a great nation and also bless Gentiles along with them as a result is at least partially fulfilled in all this. And Jacob, who had been taken his father's blessing by deceit, would not live as long as his father or grandfather, and would not die in the promised land. So there are always, we can't assume that when things are forgiven that necessarily God can wipe the slate completely clean, because of promises he's made and things that he has set up that can't be revoked. So he works it out. So as just mentioned, since Jacob had deceived his father, then he would not inherit the blessing of long life in the land that would normally go with someone who has been obedient as he had been. So Pharaoh calls the land Ramses, and you'll have to look at Constable's notes on various theories dealing with the fact that the Pharaoh by that name had not yet been born. This confuses some people and causes other people to claim the Bible is not authentic or not trustworthy. But there are valid theories about it, but I don't want to take time to do that in this lesson, so you can check that out for yourself. Now down to verse 27. And this last section of the chapter ends with the account of how the group of 75 souls grows exponentially in Egypt, and Jacob's eventual demand that Joseph must swear to take his bones back to the promised land when he dies. So this is indisputable proof, at the very least, that Jacob believes God's promises at the end of his life. He knows not only for his father at this time, but later for himself, we'll see that he's still remembering and believing these promises. So now down to chapter 48, and Joseph presents his sons to Jacob, who formally adopts them as his own, making them equal heirs with his other 11 sons. So in this way, Joseph actually receives the double portion of birthright normally given to the oldest son, which would have been Reuben. And as Constable points out, this also symbolically makes Joseph on an equal level with their father. And he was actually the oldest son of Jacob's intended first wife, Rachel. So again, it works out in ways we wouldn't expect, and we often gloss over when we read these things. So he was supposed to be the oldest son, and now he's getting the blessing through his sons, the double portion. So this is probably why the text has Jacob mention Rachel in verse 7, which otherwise seems to break the flow of Jacob's train of thought here. He's doing these blessings and so forth, and then he stops to talk about Rachel. And that's what there's speculation that I think is grounded, that that's the reason he brought it up then, is the fact that she was supposed to have been his first wife. So now down to verse 12. And after this, we see Jacob pronounces his blessing on Joseph's two sons, but Jacob blesses the younger more than the older, which at this point should come as no surprise to anyone familiar with how God has a habit of going against the social norms. Pattern repeating. So now in verse 17, it says that Joseph sees this and presumes that his nearly blind elderly father has put his right hand, that's supposed to go to the oldest son, on the younger one, so he tries to move Jacob's hands, but Jacob refuses and proceeds with the blessings. And this is where we get the idea of the laying on of hands. It was an ancient method of indicating spiritual blessing or power, and especially in this situation, a formal legal act. They didn't do a lot of writing on paper. They could write. They certainly had the ability to write, but most everyday activities such as this, a lot of it was just not put in writing. They were witnessed by credible people. And if you put your right hand on somebody and made a blessing or a pronouncement or a vow or whatever it was, this was legally binding. So that brings us to chapter 49. And now Jacob is ready to pronounce prophetic blessings and sometimes shame on all of his own 12 sons in order by age. He starts with Reuben, who was the firstborn, but his immorality and wildness will mean that he no longer will be prominent. And this is a process we've already seen in motion. And Constable notes also that the tribe of Reuben would turn out to never figure prominently in the future of Israel. Then down in verse 5, we see that he addresses Simon and Levi together, and those were the two who had plotted and executed the slaughter of the men of Shechem. And so not only are they rebuked for their quickness to shed blood, but also for having a habit, it says here, of maiming oxen for fun. Their tribes would turn out to be without their own land as a result of these things, that these were just really mean people. And so they would not get a land of their own, and they would be reduced to being scattered among all the other tribes. They'll get a few cities, but that's it. But we'll see eventually that the tribe of Levi will redeem itself in the time of Moses. So just because something's being pronounced here doesn't mean individual exceptions can be made and people can be redeemed. But this is largely the way things are turning out. And then we look down here in verse 8. And it's in contrast to the others so far. Jacob blesses Judah as the lion who rules over both his brothers and his enemies. His descendants will always include rulers and leaders until the very day the Messiah comes, as it indicates in verse 10 there. However, this does not mean there will be no interruptions. After all, not even Judah was such a great person all his life, but he was the one to repent and unify his brothers. So again, we see this redemption principle that, as with Levi, that we haven't seen yet, but we will see. We've already have been seeing the redemption of Judah because of his change of heart and how he was willing to sacrifice himself. So that's why he's being given this blessing in starting in verse 8. Now we go down to verse 11, and it's continuing the blessings of Judah, but in terms that undeniably point to the Messiah exclusively. Since they point back to the end of verse 10, they're continuing that thought. And this is where predictions are made about him tying a donkey's colt to a choice vine and washing his robes in wine. Now, we may be thinking that this refers to his crucifixion and death, but Constable thinks that these terms refer instead to the eventual millennial kingdom, since they're symbols of prosperity and blessing and security. And you can read his rationale there. This is further supported by the descriptions of his eyes and teeth. So he makes a good case for it, Constable does. But on the other hand, we can probably still also take it as symbolic of Jesus' death as well, or even the winepress of the wrath of God that will be happening during the future tribulation. So it has several possibilities, but the primary one, as far as Constable and some other commentators for this particular context, seems to be of prosperity. And now down in verse 13, he goes on to Zebulun, and Constable also notes that these are plays on words, that every name has something to do with the blessing or prophecy that will be pronounced on them. And Zebulun is promised seafront property, so it must have something to do with that. Issachar will excel at farming, and Dan will be a judge in Israel, which is how it turned out. But he adds that Dan will also be like a snake along the road who lies in ambush. And it seems from verses 17 and 18 that the victim will be his own brothers who cry out to God to be delivered from him. Now, it's upon that which many believe the future Antichrist will come from the tribe of Dan. William Dankenbring, who in my opinion has done some good research on the integrity of the Septuagint over the Masoretic text, nonetheless argues primarily from extra-biblical sources to support this theory, which, in my opinion, carry no weight because they're claiming to be prophetic statements rather than simply historical. I am all for using extra-biblical text to establish the truth of the Bible's historical claims, but not when it comes to spiritual issues or prophecies. That's exclusive to the Bible in its accuracy. So I'm kind of disappointed in Dankenbring's take on all that, but he is at least someone with some reputation as a researcher who promotes this theory that the tribe of Dan will produce the Antichrist. The few biblical citations besides this particular passage here include Revelation 7:5-8, which omits Dan from the list of the tribes of Israel, and Jeremiah 8:16 and 17, which speaks of the tribe of Dan. But that passage actually speaks of the fact that Dan is the tribe farthest north in Israel. So they would be the first to sight the enemy or hear the enemy approaching, and that's what the context there is describing. And it's the city of Dan rather than the whole tribe, if you look at it carefully. So there's a city called Dan in the northernmost part of Israel who is the first to be aware of an impending attack. That's what you get from the context there. On the other hand, it also speaks of God sending serpents to bite the people of Israel, which match Jacob's word here about Dan as a tribe being like a serpent along the road. So while it is remotely possible to make a connection to the Antichrist with the tribe of Dan, there's certainly nothing firm or clearly scriptural on which to base it. It's a stretch at best. It could be true, but from this passage, we really don't get that. And if you put it together with other passages, there really aren't very many. And we also, eventually studying prophecy, have to make sure we put all the passages together to see what we can rule out. So now let's move on to verse 19. And he moves on, Jacob moves on to Gad's blessing or prophecy. But in spite of the reference there to attacking the heels of raiders, nobody tries to say that the Antichrist must come from the tribe of Gad, because that's another, you could relate that to, especially even back in Genesis 3, when God says that the serpent will strike the heel of the seed of the woman. The seed of the serpent will strike the heel of the woman, the seed of the woman. But nobody seems to make that connection. So again, this is inconsistent application. This is inconsistent to say that because of the serpent language attached to the tribe of Dan, that it means something about the Antichrist, and yet they ignore the striking at the heel of Gad. So that's enough of a question that we can put on that theory, as that the Antichrist must come from the tribe of Dan, because there's also connection here to Gad. So we shouldn't listen uncritically to such theories. We need to check them out thoroughly from every angle. And as I mentioned, especially when it comes to prophecy, check all the prophecies about the Antichrist and not just one or two. Then he moves on to Asher, and all it says there is that he will be rich, basically. And then Naphtali is promised what seems to mean some kind of admiration or attraction that really isn't very specific. Then in verse 22, he moves on to Joseph himself, and he is described as, of course, the victim of oppression who was ultimately vindicated and avenged by God, who is referred to here as the mighty one of Jacob, which is something that's the first time that appears in the scriptures. And then down in verse 27, the final blessing is on Benjamin, and it's of him being a successful warrior. So then Jacob gives instructions about where he wants his final burial place, near the graves of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah. And no sooner than he finishes saying all these things, he breathes his last. So that was really a last-minute instruction, but he got that in. So now we move on to chapter 50, the final chapter in Genesis. And Joseph orders the Egyptian undertakers to prepare his father's body for burial, which undoubtedly involved mummification, since the process took 40 days. Then after the additional 70-day period of mourning on top of that, Joseph is granted permission to go to Canaan to bury his father. So in verse 7, off they go, and not just Joseph and his brothers, but all his Egyptian household servants, and they did leave, most of their family, the Israelis, so to speak, did, but so presumably mainly the brothers and the household of Joseph's Egyptian servants. And when they get to Canaan, which is where those burial places were, the locals there thought they were all just Egyptians that went there to mourn, so they named the place after that event. And notice in the Masoretic text on the right that the Hebrew word for Egypt is Mizraim, which refers to Egypt being divided into two parts, upper and lower. So that's where that name comes from. It's the divided land. So now down to verse 15. And now that their father is gone, Joseph's brothers are afraid that he'll avenge himself anyway. So they make up this story about Jacob telling them to tell Joseph to forgive them. And Joseph just cries some more because they're breaking his heart, because he's already assured them and given them his word that they won't be harmed. But they still have this guilty conscience that caused them to make up one last story, because the text never says he actually ever told them these things. And the timing of it is what's sealing the interpretation here, as far as I'm concerned, that this was a story they made up. So he explains again that he can't be angry with them, since it was all in God's plan to save the entire nation. That's what his motivation was, what Joseph's motivation was this whole time, all these years, was that he trusted God. And once he saw the whole picture, he was even more convinced that he had no reason to be upset with any of the people who had mistreated him, because he saw God's hand in it. And that's something a lesson everybody even today needs to learn, because we often just think, that God has abandoned us and or maybe he's not real or something like that, when in fact, if we're just patient and trusting, it will work out. But it's guaranteed not to work out if we don't trust him, if we claim to belong to him. So let's go on down to verse 24, the last paragraph of the chapter and the book. But though he is the second youngest, Joseph realizes in time that he will be the next to die. For whatever reason, he has a much shorter lifespan than his brothers. So he makes his brothers swear to take his bones with them in the distant future after God comes to rescue them. A statement which must have sounded very strange at the time, since they were well protected at the moment, and as far as we know, they were not aware of the prophecy of their eventual enslavement. So they probably didn't know what he meant by that, but they agreed to do it anyway. And so that's a little bit of evidence of their own faith and trust. So he makes this final request, which is hard to refuse anyway, about them needing rescuing eventually, and that when they do leave Egypt, they must remember to take his remains with them. So though Joseph's body is embalmed per Egyptian custom, he's not buried, but just placed in a coffin to await his eventual departure to the Promised Land when his people return there. Because it doesn't say he was buried, it just said he was placed in a coffin. So he's in some kind of mausoleum or something for who knows how many years at that point, and that's where that ends. So that concludes our study of the book of Genesis, and we've learned a few things. One, that God chooses to work both through and around his people, either because of them or in spite of them, either for their ultimate good or ultimate fate, depending on their choices. We've also learned that in this process, God habitually chooses the least likely vessels to carry out his plans. His focus is always on character, though never at the expense of his promises of physical blessings. There's not an either or exclusive. These things can both be true at the same time, the spiritual and the physical. He looks past a person's present condition to their future potential. And that's a theme that will be reinforced again in the life of King David, who at the time he was chosen was the despised son of Jesse, if not the youngest, one of the youngest of having 7 older brothers, and eventually also the lowly town of Bethlehem. This is how God operates. He's not going to pick who we think he should pick. He's not going to pick the biggest, strongest kid for the football team, because that's not the game he's playing. So anytime God intervenes in history, and we will see this throughout the Old Testament especially, he picks the least likely people. And even when Jesus picked his disciples, he did not pick the religious leaders. He did not pick the rich for the most part. He picked tax collectors who were despised. He picked fishermen. So when we pick people for anything to do with spiritual matters, we need to keep this same principle in mind, because we look on the flesh. We judge people as being restricted on the basis of their skin color or their gender or something like that, or where they're from, or their lack of certain kinds of education, when such things have really no bearing on their spiritual condition or their blessings by the Holy Spirit or their gifts. So God's way, if we look at the Bible, is not the way of patriarchy necessarily, even though God is choosing a line through patriarchy, through the males. We have to remember that the original promise to crush the serpent's seed was the seed of the woman, not the man, and that there are reasons that aren't fully explained to us for everything that happens between those 2 points, between the fall of man and eventual redemption. But more about that when we get to the New Testament eventually. But right now, we're going to finish up our study of Genesis and hopefully have some lessons on Exodus in the near future.